Namaste and good evening. On behalf of Sage Presage Consulting, I welcome you all to our webinar, An Emerging Era of Power Women 5, Leading Risks Through Uncertainty. I'm Ila Longani, founder and CEO of Sage Presage Consulting. We are a holistic risk management and strategic advisory firm. Today is the fifth edition of this annual series marking International Women's Day. 5 years ago, we started this webinar with a simple belief that the women in risk, security, compliance, and governance deserved a global platform, not just to be celebrated, but to be heard. Every year, we have gathered voices from across the world to have an honest conversation, and this year is no different. This year's theme is leading risk through uncertainty, and I can tell you, of all the 5 editions we've had, this theme seems to be most urgent, the most necessary. So let's get into it. Here's the agenda for today. After the welcome note and initial context setting, we'll move on to the panel discussion where we are joined in by some of the very distinguished women leaders from across 5 countries, followed by a fireside chat on global leadership with our special guest, Dr. Mary Grogan, who is joining us from Canada. We'll conclude with the closing remarks. Questions will be taken up at the end of each segment. So let's get going. Before we dive into the theme today, I just want to take a moment to reflect on the journey this series has taken. Our inaugural event in 2022 sparked a powerful conversation on the emerging era of power women, building, leading, and reimagining the future. In 2023, we explored how women are shaping the current decade and the critical role they play in new and emerging technologies. In 2024, the focus shifted to reshaping security, risk, and resilience, where we explored how women's representation is redefining how organizations approach risks itself. In 2025, we turned to resilience, innovation, and the future of risk, redefining how organizations build for what comes next. And now, in 2026, we are here. The world in 2022 and the world today are not the same. The rules that held for decades are being rewritten simultaneously across geopolitics, technology, economics, and nobody asked for the permission to do that. This year's theme did not come from a brainstorm. It came from every conversation Sage Presage has had over the past 12 months. Every moment when someone said, we just don't know what's coming next. This is not a trend report. This is an operational reality of 2026. And that is exactly what we are here to discuss today. Let's look at the world right now. We often treat geopolitics as a backdrop to business. But in 2026, it has become the foreground. When 68% of executives identify political risk as a top 3 threat, it's not just about elections. They are looking at the fundamental weaponization of the corporate supply chain. We are seeing shift from global integration to increase in decoupling, where tariffs and sanctions are used as primary tools of statecraft. In this climate, traditional feminine traits like collaboration and empathy are becoming clear competitive advantages. Reducing risk now requires more than financial audits. It demands relational intelligence. Women leaders are building brokered networks that help organizations navigate complexity across geographies through trust, partnerships, and cultural agility, and not just data. To stay ahead, organizations must move from reactive fixes to proactive geopolitical scenario planning, led by those who are grounded in the interconnectedness of people, policy, and profit. From technological standpoint, we are currently witnessing a massive governance gap. While nearly 80% of organizations have rushed to adopt AI, our regulatory and safety frameworks are trailing miles behind. The risk isn't just the flashy headlines of deepfakes, it's the internal erosion of trust when AI is adopted faster than our ability to govern it. Therefore, creative corporate governance is now a leadership imperative. Women are uniquely positioned to lead responsible AI, driving inclusive frameworks where security is not just technical firewall, but a cultural one. Women prioritize transparency over speed and ensure automation doesn't scale bias. The opportunity is to build human-centric governance, keeping organizations anchored in ethics as technology evolves at pace. The World Economic Forum identifies geoeconomic confrontation as the #1 risk for 2026, and its impact is deep and deeply human, affecting visa regimes, talent mobility, and the safety of teams in volatile regions. Risk today is not about people, it's more about people than systems. Static protocols are no longer enough. Organizations need dynamic, real-time intelligence that accounts for the human cost of every decision. In times of crisis, the most effective leaders choose clarity over perfection. Women leaders often recognize that resilience isn't a CSR initiative, it's an operational priority. By prioritizing executive protection, psychological safety, workforce continuity, they ensure organizations don't just survive disruption, but retain the human capital to thrive. This is the essence of leadership in the current time, standing as a pillar of steadiness in a moving world. So the question is, when the rule book breaks down, what does leadership actually require? Here's the thing. In stable environments, organizations reward a specific capability, optimize, follow the process, execute predictably, the ability to take a known playbook and run it better than anyone else. And for a long time that worked because the environment, was stable enough that the playbook held. But uncertain environments demand something fundamentally different. They demand the ability to read ambiguous signals before they become crises, to build trust across differences, and perhaps most importantly, to know when the frameworks you have relied on no longer applies and have the conviction to say so. These are not the same skill set. They are genuinely different capabilities, and most organizations are still hiring for the first set in an environment that increasingly demands the second. And I want you to sit with this for a moment. Uncertainty doesn't demand better optimizers. It demands better navigators. Now, here's the thing, and here's where the conversation gets interesting, because those capabilities I just spoke about regarding ambiguity, building trust, making decisions when the information is incomplete, they're not absent from the talent pool. They exist, they are visible, measurable, they are just under-deployed. Research on senior women leaders found they are chosen for high-risk turnaround roles precisely because of their ability to manage crisis, because of their focus on collaboration, consensus building, and stakeholder trust. And a research by McKinsey reinforced that women consistently demonstrate the leadership behaviors critical in crisis and recovery. Another study on leadership under uncertainty found that women leaders demonstrate measurable trust advantages under uncertain conditions, which is precisely when organizations need stakeholder confidence to hold. Frankly, this is not a diversity argument. It's a capability argument, a specific research-backed, business-relevant capability argument. The capabilities that uncertainty demands exist. They're already in the room. The question is whether organizations are deploying them or leaving them on the table. Research from Harvard Business Review shows higher disengagement under male leaders versus female leaders, a direct cost to productivity and retention. Another study also finds or links women leaders and board members to stronger, more proactive enterprise risk management. Gender diverse teams show fewer strategic blind spots. In uncertain times, blind spots aren't inconvenient, they're existential. The organizations that recognize diverse leadership as a competitive advantage and not just a compliance exercise will navigate what's ahead most effectively. That's not an opinion, that's what the data says. I want to leave you with one thought before we move on to our panel discussion. Risk management as a discipline was largely built during a period of relative stability, predictable technology cycles, relatively homogeneous decision-making rules. That world is gone now, and the framework built for it are under enormous stress. What gets built next, the new frameworks, the new governance structures, the new methodologies for navigating this era, that is not determined yet. It is being written right now in organizations like yours, in conversations like this one. The dimensions that existing risk frameworks consistently underweight, like behavioral and psychological risk signals, stakeholder trust, community level intelligence. These are not peripheral concerns. In a world where reputational collapse can move markets overnight, where public trust is now a board level issue, these are the blind spots that are actively costing organizations. This is the white space. This is where the next generation of risk thinking gets built. And I believe that the women in this space are uniquely positioned to help build it, not because of charity or representation targets, but because the vantage point that comes from operating outside the default that shape the kind of thinking this moment needs. The frameworks for this new era are being written right now. That is not a threat, that's an invitation. Sage Presage was built on exactly this premise, that risk intelligence requires human intelligence, not just technical frameworks, that the future of risk advisory needed to be broader, more integrative, more human. We work with organizations globally across the full spectrum of risk: corporate security, cybersecurity, fraud risk management, ethics and compliance, health and safety, crisis management, ESG consulting, market entry support, because real world risk does not arrive in neat categories, and our solutions don't either. We have been recognized as an outstanding cybersecurity consultant and as the best risk management strategic advisory firm. We are empaneled on the She-Box portal by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, Government of India, for the POSH Act compliance. I share these not to impress you, but because they are evidence that the approach works. The human-centered, intelligence-led risk advisory delivers results. A woman-led firm built on the conviction that risk management needs to evolve is not a niche proposition in 2026. It is exactly what the moment calls for. And now, the part that I look forward to most, every year is the panel discussion. The women joining us on this panel today are not here to talk about leading through uncertainty in theory. They're already doing it every single day in boardrooms, in field operations, in intelligence agencies, in organizations that cannot afford to get it wrong. So let's hear it from them. Please be mindful that all Q&A will be towards the end of the session. So please put your question either in the chat box or just raise the hand and we'll come back to you. With this, let me introduce and welcome our moderator, Cynthia Kaplan, who will kind of introduce the panelists and lead us into the discussion and conversation. Cynthia Kaplan is an executive search leader with over 2 decades of experience advising on senior talent across security, risk, and other roles within clean tech, mining, industrial, technology, and many more sectors. She partners with boards, founders, investors to place C-suite leaders who drive growth, resilience, and transformation, working across the US, Latin America, and Canada. Previously, she held senior roles at Kroll and Control Risks and bring experience in executive search, leadership advisory, and high-stakes environment. Cynthia, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. As Ila said, we're living in a moment where uncertainty isn't something that comes and goes. It's something leaders are navigating every single day, whether it's, the geopolitical shifts, supply chain disruption, or the speed at which information and, of course, misinformation travels. The ground is constantly moving. And that's exactly why this conversation today matters. Today's session, An Emerging Era of Power Women, Leading Risk Through Uncertainty, is really about how leadership is evolving in real time, not in theory, but in practice, when decisions need to be made without perfect information and when the stakes are high, as Ila also mentioned. What makes the panel especially compelling is the range of perspectives. Our speakers have worked across governments, national security, crisis response, global organizations, and deeply human-centered environments. They've experienced risk from multiple angles, and that brings a level of insight you don't often get in one conversation. We'll talk about what resilience really looks like today, how leaders stay grounded when multiple risks collide and why trust, culture, and human judgment are becoming just as critical as systems and processes. At the heart of it, this is a conversation about leadership, how you show up, how you make decisions, how you bring others with you when things are uncertain. So with that, let's get into it. And I have the great pleasure of introducing you our extraordinary group of panelists. In no particular order, I am going to start with Farah Benis. Farah's, and I've shortened these bios, I have to say, so I encourage everybody to go onto LinkedIn and read their complete bios, but for the sake of time, I'm going to give you a snapshot of who they are. Farah is a security and risk leader, specializing in high risk and remote operations across Africa and the Middle East. As managing director of FFA Security, she advises governments and organizations on resilience, violence, prevention, and people-centric security. What sets her apart is her ability to bridge frontline realities with strategic frameworks, bringing trust, community, insight, and operational rigor into how organizations manage risk. Megha Sharma. Megha is a people and risk specialist focused on workplace safety, compliance, and culture. With over a decade of experience across global organizations, she helps companies build environments where risks, especially human and cultural, are identified early and managed effectively. Her work sits at the intersection of governance, inclusion, and organizational resilience, making her perspectives especially relevant in today's evolving risk landscape. Megan Bolduc. Megan is an Executive Assistant Director of Intelligence and Information Sharing at NCIS, where she leads efforts to address cyber, criminal, and national security threats. She brings deep experience across intelligence, counterterrorism, and global operations, including work with the FBI. Megan's expertise is in making high-stakes decisions with incomplete information and translating intelligence into action when it matters most. Sev Cokayne, am I pronouncing that right? Sorry, Sev, is a global expert in organizational and city-level resilience, currently serving as Director of Risk Consulting at EY. She has helped shape international standards on resilience, crisis management, and brings rare firsthand experience as a director, survivor, responder, and advisor. Her strength is in connecting strategy with real-world execution, helping organizations navigate complexities that are moving risk environments. So since I ended with Sev, I'll start with you for the first question. I just ask our panelists to keep it short to a couple minutes. Each of you have about 3 questions, and so we can have plenty of room at the end for questions. So Sev, what does organizational resilience truly mean today beyond business continuity plans and compliance checklists? And in a world of supply chain disruptions and regulatory divergence, how should organizations rethink resilience to move beyond traditional models and build it across entire ecosystems, including partners, vendors, and governments, rather than within silos?
Thanks, Cynthia, and thank you everyone for having me. It's especially thank you for your attempt to my last name. It is actually pronounced Cokayne, so you will never forget that.
Okay.
And it is absolutely memorable for networking events, job interviews. It's it's a it's a special kind of last name. But no, thank you for your question. So I guess kind of let's set the scene here, right? The nature of disruption has changed quite significantly, right? I mean, who knew a pandemic would lead to a rise in cybersecurity issues? You then have kind of the advancement and the role of technology, right? It's now playing in a way, not just how we operate, right? So from data analysis to process management, but now it's completely integral to even how we think and act and make decisions, right, on risks, right? So now we're seeing technology is no longer just a vehicle to get to the end goal of that enablement of having resilience in place and that capability, but now it's becoming quite a core to and a key dependency instead. So now we're kind of facing the need to future-proof an operating and governance model to an unknown trajectory of our own risk and operating environment, right? So you've got so many things at play right now, and all of them are impacting each other and interconnected, right? And we cannot fathom now what AI is going to be doing to advance that, elevate that, or make it more vulnerable, right? We just can't predict everything. So kind of what I kind of was thinking was that organizations need to now expand their resilience beyond operational tactics. And we need to kind of move towards those kind of institutional strategic domains, those big ticket items, right? Financial domains, institutional, technological. We need to elevate this and bring it up a notch across the business. So that means kind of moving from a bilateral to a more multi-party governance model, right? So that's maybe across suppliers, vendors, your industry group, your regulators, restructuring your response models beyond scenario planning and more towards the longevity and concurrency of disruptions instead. I think the term polycrisis is going to be coming up a lot more. And then mapping and integrating your resiliency across the value chain. So we're no longer looking at recovering a process, but now a whole system, right? In your internal ecosystem, as well as the relationship that yours has to your industry or I guess to the operating front of all your industry peers as well. You know, it's your supply chain, everything outside your bubble now of control. So now you're no longer trapping resilience in corporate functions. We're kind of looking at this from a transversal capability by design. That could even look like articulating and designing your controls for integration from the outset, so that they're not implemented in silos anymore. That we are articulating controls to be implemented in an integrated way from the outset. Aligning your investment decisions and capital strategies with ecosystem risk, not in response to ecosystem risk. So kind of the whole point of this is that ecosystem resilience. So we're not looking at enterprise resilience and operational resilience and all these other buzzwords. I'm thinking about ecosystem resilience becoming a strategic commodity, not a procedural one.
Great. Yeah, that's very insightful and kind of following on that, Farah, like in our regions facing geopolitical instability and fragile supply chains, how should organizations rethink people-centric security and what matters more in such environments? You know, strong systems or strong trust? You know, how do you build both of those things?
Yeah, so just to say, it's nice to be here among so many brilliant women. So thank you for having me. So look, I think the first shift that organizations need to make is to stop treating people as an afterthought to their operations. In unstable environments, actually in any environment, people are not separate from resilience. They're central to it. So if your staff and your contractors and your local partners and communities do not feel that they are informed and supported and safe, then your systems are not going to hold for very long, are they? So for me, people-centric security means understanding that your risk doesn't just sit in the register, right? It shows up every moment in fatigue and in confusion and fear and disengagement, poor communication, and the breakdown of trust between leadership and those on the ground. So when we're working in fragile environments, those softer issues become hard risks very, very quickly. So to me, it's not really a choice between strong systems and strong trust, because you really, really need both. Your systems give you structure and consistency and escalation routes for reporting, right? But trust is actually what makes people use them and believe in them and then speak up early enough for them to actually matter. So what's important is that you build these strong systems, and you do that through clarity, right? Clear reporting lines, clear crisis protocols, clear welfare measures, clear decision-making authority. But you build your trust through behavior. And communication is a massive part of that, and communicating honestly, you know, not over reassuring people, because no one needs that and no one trusts that, but also not withholding information unnecessarily, right?
Mhm.
A big issue as well, taking local knowledge seriously, because too many organizations, and I work with a lot of international organizations, they still rely on this top-down model where decisions are made far, far away from the reality on the ground. So I feel like the organizations that do this well are the organizations that tend to listen better. They engage local expertise, they understand the cultural context, and they recognize as well that security is not just the protecting assets. It's protecting people in a way that allows our operations to remain ethical and credible and sustainable. That's my thinking.
That's great. And, continuing on the topic of security, Megan, you've led risk at a national security level. How do you approach decision-making when the stakes are high and sometimes information is incomplete?
Yeah, thank you to everyone for having me. I really appreciate being able to join the panel today. So I'd like to start the answer to this question by really emphasizing the importance of establishing a knowledge baseline. I know to some that this might seem kind of intuitive, but what I mean by this is directly asking the questions that are necessary for collective understanding, starting with what do we know? What sources do we have available? Have we been able to validate that information? What do we not know? Who needs to know what we do know? And then who can help us to fill those critical intelligence gaps that we've identified? It's also important to make sure that we're incorporating diverse perspectives as we're answering these questions to make sure that any information that we have is balanced and also includes alternative points of view. Next, we have to come up with a plan of action. It's really important to specify and narrow what your organization's unique role is in a particular situation so that you can properly determine what those actions and decisions might be. And that really is focused on who the customer is and who the stakeholder is and the information that they need. So what is your team going to uniquely provide to answer any threat-related questions? And that might be depending on the expected outcomes. That could be, briefs or products, but it's really important to be clear and specific with regard to the outcomes that you need and expect. And it's okay to also be a little uncomfortable here, right? You may only have 80% of the information, and quite honestly, you're probably lucky if you have 80% of the information. But the idea is to do the best you can with the information that you have available and combine that with your background and experience. And that could be lessons learned and best practices that you're able to incorporate, but also having an open mind where you're aggressively seeking additional information to update the stance in a particular threat area or the outputs that you've provided. I'd also want to emphasize making sure that we're leveraging our partners. In the national security world, it's really critical that we're actively collaborating and coordinating with those that provide complementary information to what it is that we know. And it's absolutely essential that we're building relationships outside of crisis. I think so often, partners come to mind when we really need that information at the last minute. But if we're able to actually build the relationships now, when the crisis arises, we'll be able to leverage one another a little more efficiently and effectively. So ultimately, as long as our team has the necessary resources to pull together information that's needed, that we're asking really good questions, and we're leveraging one another, that will at least start us on a proper path to success.
Great. Wow. Thank you for that, Megan. And Megha, you've worked in environments with high human stakes, from human trafficking of global organizations, human trafficking to global organizations. How does risk leadership change when the human impact is immediate? It is immediate and visible.
Thank you so much for the question. And firstly, I'd like to thank everyone again for having me on this panel last year as well as this year. When we talk about human impact, which is immediate and visible, the risk stop being theoretical. It becomes deeply personal and time sensitive. So in such environment, the biggest shift is you're no longer managing the risk, you are holding consequences in real time. And you have to make decision very fast. and decision can't wait for the perfect data. So you operate with incomplete information at the cost of imperfection. You can, whatever data is available, information is available for you, with you, you have to make decision based on that and move with it. But also changes I've noticed is the lens. So, in a normal corporate settings, we, frame risk as financial, legal, reputational. But in a high human stake environment, risk is fundamentally about dignity, safety, and irreversible harm. So leadership is less about control and it is more about speed with judgment than the clarity under the pressure, especially the emotional pressure, because, human stakes are involved, the story is attached, especially when when we used to work with the survivors of trafficking, each and every survivor came with the backdrop story, which was really personal and really conflicted. So keeping all that in mind, you have to move ahead with the clarity and you have to ensure your team is moving ahead with the clarity. And the most important is ethical courage. So what I've learned very quickly is the policy don't protect people, but people who are willing to act do. And that becomes very important. And that's the lesson I carry, that if your systems are strong, but your people hesitate, you don't have, they're not telling you what are the risks, you're not able to make decision on time, the risk will materialize. And that's why it becomes very important.
All right, great. Thanks for that, Megha. And kind of following on that, Farah, in these uncertain environments, fear and misinformation can spread quickly. How should organizations manage perception risk alongside physical risk and operational risk?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest mistakes organizations make is assuming that if something is not operationally true, it's then not risky. But perception has real-world consequences. So if people believe that leadership is hiding something, as I was talking about before, if staff don't trust their internal communications, or if misinformation fills this vacuum, then that shapes behavior just as much as the facts do. Perception risk matters because people do not make decisions based purely on technical reality. Make them based on what they believe is happening and what they think leadership is doing, or whether they feel safe and informed, right? And this has a massive effect on morale, on retention, on incident reporting, stakeholder confidence, even the organization's ability to respond effectively in a crisis. So perception risk has to be managed as part of the wider risk picture and not as a separate comms issue just parked off to one side. Security, communications, HR, and your leadership as well need to be far more joined up, because when those functions are operating in silos, misinformation will move faster than the truth every single time. And in today's very chronically online and AI-fueled world, misinformation is a huge threat. So the starting point that you want to be at is speed, clarity, and credibility. Those are, these are sort of three main key points. You need to be communicating early, even if you do not yet have the answer. And it's okay to not have the answer. Be honest about uncertainty. People can tolerate not having full information, but what they struggle with is feeling that information is being managed for them rather than being shared with them. And the second point, consistency. So if internal messaging says one thing, but the lived experience is saying another thing, then trust erodes immediately. And once you lose that trust, your rumors become far more powerful. And just one final point, organizations need to become much, much more aware of the information environment that they're actually operating in. And that includes social media narratives, their staff sentiment, their stakeholder concerns, and the wider political and social contexts in which they're working in. Risk leaders today really need to understand that narratives can amplify harm and it distorts judgment and it very much can destabilize your operations. So if we're managing risk in today's modern world, it really means managing both what is actually happening, but also what people believe is happening, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and those are definitely good points, and it's I think key for leadership to identify that. And I wanted to ask Sev, because you've worked across government, cities, and global corporations, how do you see the role of leadership evolving in managing especially large scale uncertainty?
I think that's a great question, because I feel like that seems to be the main topic you'll see on LinkedIn as well. Everyone has an opinion on this, and I'm loving everyone's articles and perceptions of this, especially from other companies as well. And probably what I'm going to say may not be too different, but for me, I think leadership is going through a very, very significant shift, right? It has been probably the most significant in decades. And, you know, the uncertainty we're talking about now is kind of driven by like geopolitical volatility. We're looking at AI acceleration. You know, we're shifting workforce expectations and how we operate, right? There's now continuous disruption, right? This is now no longer in this scenario, in this nuance, we're going to do this. And then these are the kinds of decisions we're going to make and the resources we need. And then in this scenario, it's completely out the window, right? These events are almost built to take us beyond our plans now, right? That's it, done, right? Resilience is now the everything else outside of that realm now. So what needs to change is now not what leaders must do about it, but how they go about it, right? So we're now looking at leaders, you know, having to shift from that traditional competence to the capacity for that complexity, right? So unlearning all those old assumptions and completely embracing that ambiguity. So letting go of those outdated scripts, right? Around speed and reassurance and command and control and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And now we need them to widen their tolerance for ambiguity, right? They now need to just operate with it. That's it now. You're not going to have everything on a plate. It's completely out the window. You need to now have the ability to, right? And it's no longer the ability to solve the problem. It's the ability to guide, direct, navigate, and X, Y, Z, right? All those key soft skills that we kind of need in organizations. So now we're looking at strategic thinking, now moving away or being no longer reserved for the executive level, right? We need to now start looking at a default requirement across leadership layers, right? So it's no longer top down now. This needs to be bottom up, right? At the lowest possible capability and level. Like it has to be done that way. It's no longer the authoritative directive, right, from the top. You know, you've got your crisis layer, then you got your, you know, your business continuity. You've got the different layers. We can no longer operate and work that way, right? When bad stuff happens, this needs to be leadership from every single layer and every single angle.
Yeah, I've seen that too in my recruiting for leaders. You know, security and cybersecurity roles have been, you know, pushed up some to the C level. It's become a very, you know, important position and topic, and the CEO needs to be informed probably daily on those events now. Megan, you know, what are some considerations for leaders and teams to think about related to intelligence-led risk programs? I mean, how can organizations incorporate these concepts to better anticipate emerging risks and inform decision-making, you know, as you know, Sev just said, in this very ambiguous world that we live in?
Yeah, intelligence-led risk leadership, it's a really significant consideration because we have so many dynamic and complex threats that are thrown at us every day. We have so many competing priorities and the risks are really high. So I think with this question, you know, the focus really here is how do we teach our teams to anticipate threats and the risks of tomorrow? And this really requires a lot of focused and deliberate approach on the part of leadership, because it's very easy to get caught up and what has to be done immediately today, and what's the fire of the day, and what needs to be put out right now. But teams can, really be talked to in a way about, different ways of thinking and different ways of approaching problems. And so it's important from the leadership perspective to really emphasize the importance of foresight and anticipatory analysis, and just ask the question, what do you think could impact our business? And that is not only like the business itself, but also the environments in which the business operates or different components of the business operate. We also want to make sure that we're driving adaptability, making sure that the team understands it's important to be flexible, to recognize changes or anomalies, because a small change, it might not seem like a big deal. One anomaly may not seem like a big deal, but if you really look at it and consider what the implications may be, it could actually be a lot more important. And then, as Sev mentioned, strategic thinking, super important. It's something that we really have to teach our teams to do, because again, they're really bogged down sometimes in the threat of the day. But if we actually teach them to take a step back and consider what is the threat, a month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, 3 years from now, it really gives them the opportunity to think hard on that. And as leaders, we have to actually give them the space to think through the problem set, because so often, we're throwing tasks and things. But if we say, hey, I want you to chew on this problem, and then you take a step back and give them that space and opportunity, really good things can happen. I had a leader once ask me when I was leading our criminal threat division, what's the next big thing? And I always kind of think about that, because we do, firefight every day. But if we really think hard on what is coming down the road and what does the leadership need to know, we can stay on top of things. And then also understanding what is the role that our business and our teams in that business play in, mitigating those threats going forward. That will allow us to be really focused in gathering the proper relevant information for that particular threat. And then, making sure that we're communicating those effectively and that our higher ups are aware of the things that could potentially impact the business. It's also important to note, if our leaders have expressed that they have tolerance for risk in certain areas, but not others, we obviously want to make sure that our intelligence efforts are aligned properly with that. I think, threat intelligence has a really important role in business operations and continuity. So, I'm hopeful that we can continue to get our workforces to think a little more strategically going forward.
Great. Wow. Thanks for that. And continuing on those lines, in times of uncertainty, Megha, what are the early warning signs within an organization that leaders often overlook from a human risk perspective? What role does organizational culture play in the early detection of risks, especially when risks are not yet visible at a structural level? I know you've dug deeper into that, so I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Sure, I think it's a very, very good question and very relevant also, because that's what a lot of leaders and organizations miss. Because, in a critical human risk, in a critical situation, human risk or any risk really announce themselves loudly. They show up as patterns and, in subtle shifts in behavior, in hesitation. So some early sign leaders often overlook our delayed escalations. Issues may be discussed informally, but are not formally reported, right? Then over alignment in meetings. Either there's too much of agreement, too much of silence, and a very little challenge. You see people have withdrawn themselves. Then there's a change in language. You see employee becomes cautious, or they're neutral, or whatever they say is scripted. Then there's a withdrawal of key performance. There could be no exit, but there would be a disengagement from critical conversation, or no say in critical conversation, which happens. And there's a normalization of discomfort. So, you hear statements like, this is how it is, let's not escalate, let's not talk about it, we can't do anything about it. So these are risks in disguise. And this is where the culture becomes your strongest detection system, or it can be your biggest blind spot also. So organizations which are able to work through these challenges are like, the rest of the panelists said, where people can come up and talk about the challenges they are facing. or what information, or the line of information is very clear. There's no misinformation which is spreading. And when there's consistency in behavior from the leaders, they say, you please come up to me with challenge. We'll not become defensive. We'll think it through as a team and find a solution to it. And it's important that the culture or the organization is creating a psychological safety for employees, wherein they can come and talk through their heart and discuss what they're facing. And the organization can provide, leaders can provide support for the same.
Yeah, a lot of questions of leadership and how that's changing have come up. And Farah, through the security edit, you engage deeply with industry narratives. What shifts are you seeing and how organizations are thinking about security and risk leadership today?
So much like what Megha and Megan were both saying, we're seeing a gradual, but I'd say good, shift away from the old model of security leadership, which was quite narrow in scope, purely reactive, very heavily operational. And I think more organizations are starting to understand that security and risk leadership has to be broader, has to be more strategic, and more connected as well within culture, their communications, and long-term resilience. For a very long time, security has been something seen as something that sits in the background, right? It's necessary, but it's largely separate from the bigger business conversation. And I think what's changing now is that organizations are having to confront overlapping crises constantly, geopolitical instability, misinformation, cyber threats, insider risk, burnout, public scrutiny, supply chain fragility. I can go on and on and
all
on.
of the above.
But all of that means that security leaders are being pulled closer to questions of trust and ethics and reputation and their organizational behavior and into the larger business function. I think I'm also seeing a lot more recognition that leadership in this space is not just about control, right? It's about judgment. It's about being able to operate with incomplete information, to be able to communicate calmly under pressure, make sense of very complex things without creating more noise, which, I spoke earlier about this AI world and chronically online world. There is so much noise out there. And actually, the ability to be able to speak coherently is becoming something a very rare and wonderful skill. But all of that is a very different skill set from simply just responding to incidents now. And the other shift that people are starting to take more seriously is it's that human side of resilience, right? And not just in the well-being sense, but in a practical risk sense. So, psychological safety has been, mentioned by every single person on this panel. Staff confidence, leadership credibility, culture. All of these things used to be side conversations, right? And they're now leading conversations. They're becoming part of the resilience conversation because they directly affect whether people will speak up, how they adapt, but equally how they hold the line under stress. And so that said, I think there's still some distance to go because a lot of organizations talk about integrated risk, but they're still operating in silos, right?
Yeah.
So a lot are talking about people, but they're also still underinvesting in trust. So the direction of travel is positive, but I think the real challenge as well is now moving from the language side to implementation.
Yeah, and Megan, maybe I'll ask you to follow up on that. I mean, in this world where so many crises seem to happen at once in different parts of the organization, multiple threats are converging. It's just the reality for global organization. In your opinion, what separates the leaders who hold steady, from the ones who lose the room, let's say?
Yeah, I would say it's really easy to get overwhelmed in any threat environment. Those who work that every day, we kind of learn over time to expect the unexpected, and we also kind of know to pace ourselves a little bit. So, it's important to, take that breath, like we talked about, kind of work to be calm and cool and collected in those high pressure environments. And there are things I think that we can do as leaders to set ourselves and our teams up for success. And, one of those things is operating with some urgency. We definitely want to make sure that we have as much information as possible, but threat doesn't wait. And so we want to make sure that we are operating as swiftly as possible to understand what is at hand and who needs to have that information. We also need to make sure that we're very clear on our purpose. What is our actual role, within the mission, and making sure that we're staying out ahead of risks and that people understand what it is we're doing and why. And then clarity of what the outcomes are expected to be. What is it that we want our teams to do? And that clarity, kind of like transparency, like we were talking about earlier, is really important to the team. And we have to ensure that what we're asking of our teams is really aligned to our mission and the thresholds that we have set in place. So there is some consistency as well in that. It's also important that as leaders that we can anticipate asks, because the more information that we can put together and push out, the better that helps to build the trust and credibility in our teams. We also want to make sure that we know our teams. Not only do they have the capabilities and resources that they need, but also that why. The why has come up a lot recently, in our workspaces, I think, because there are so many threats. And so when we prioritize something, or I think our workforce is trying to understand, okay, what is it that we need to be doing? Who's the audience? What's the intended impact? And that really helps to set them up to provide us with the most efficient and effective intelligence support going forward. Also, knowing the audience, one of the most important questions that we can ask is what's in it for them? Like, what information can we put together and provide that's going to help them make a decision, or help them to further their viewpoint, or give them an additional perspective that maybe they didn't have before. And we want to make sure that the right people have the right information at the right time. Again, that goes to like trust and credibility for our programs and what we're leading. And then finally, I would emphasize the importance of understanding second and third order effects. So while it's really easy to get wrapped around that threat of today, we have to understand how this particular threat picture could potentially impact, other things down the road in the longer term. So kind of taking like that broader view, and, just making sure that the so what of the information that we're providing is very clear to our decision makers.
Wow, thank you for that. And I want to be aware of the time. We're coming up to the top of the hour. So I think in closing, I want to ask Sev, you've been a disaster survivor, a field reporter, a practitioner, and an auditor. That's a combination of vantage points almost nobody else has. What does each of these roles teach you that the others cannot, and which one changed how you think about risk the most?
Yeah, I think also the term is nerd. So I think a nerd that has no life. No, I'm just one of those weirdos that have kind of, I guess, purposefully carved out a career that can give me a more 360 understanding on how to protect what matters most, right? It was just a keen interest that turned into a career. I guess what was driving me is I wanted to really understand the challenges, limitations, pain points, opportunities, all that kind of stuff, right? From each role and angle in achieving resilience, and then all the cogs and insights in between. That's kind of also helped me quite greatly then understand and operate at each line of defense, right? Those 3 lines of defense. So how to do it, how to govern it, how to make sure it's in place, how to check everyone's homework to make sure that they've done it, from an audit perspective, and then also how to set the direction on its evolution. So yeah, I think my husband says I'm married to my work more than him, but that's debatable. In regards to your kind of second part to that question about kind of which roles kind of really changed the way I kind of think and operate, I would say being in it being actual in the disaster itself as a recipient of that disaster. And I'll give you an example, or I'll set the scene a little bit. We were heavily impacted by Hurricane Harvey in the US, in Texas. It was the second most costly hurricane in US history. It made landfall 3 times in 6 days. So no one had time to recover, right? At all. You know, once you're starting to get back to where you were, you're back in it again. And that's not just from a personal perspective, that's also from the emergency services and the government itself and their capability to respond. It was also the highest rainfall amount in a single storm. So we had a plethora of different types of risks and hazards all happening at the same time and being beaten to death in those 6 days. And the impacts actually were no power, no telecommunications to call for help from the emergency services or to receive the tornado alerts, no access. There was no access to our location because of the flooding, right? So no one could reach us anyway. And the emergency services had no capacity to help the 6 million residents all at once in Houston. So if you think of that, think of it from a crisis exercise or tabletop experience, right? If you were to say to a client or a CMT, right, this exercise, we're going to remove all of your resources and all of your dependencies are unavailable. This would be the most unrealistic scenario in an exercise ever, right? You'd have everyone around the room be like, well, that's not going to, obviously that's not going to work. That's not going to happen, right? People would just check out the building and wouldn't really be fully engaged in that exercise, right? So, and also kind of from my perspective, I've been that flood planner, right? I've been an emergency responder. I've got a degree in it, and all this X, Y, Z. But you know what? In that moment, I was just a mum with a 6-month-old baby and a husband and a cat, right? And that was it. That's all you're deduced to. That's it. And don't get me wrong, I planned for everything. We prepared as much as we could before the alerts went up. We did everything we could anyway. But imagine having nothing to fall back on, no resources, no help, no dependencies, and going, right, what do we do with this? So to be honest, I challenge anyone to find a crisis leader more resilient than a mother whose child is in danger. I can tell you that. But how this has changed me going forward is how I've approached response strategies, right? With a more human lens, right? Whether it's customer-centric, employee-centric, it's kind of what about the person on the ground? What about them? What about the experience that they're going through? Either it's a user or a client. What are they going through? And the only other time I've seen somebody think that way and execute it is during my time at Visa. We had a humongous regional outage in Europe and the Middle East and Northern Africa. And it was absolutely chaotic for our CMT. And I remember our CEO, who's our crisis leader, Charlotte Hogg, fantastic. I saw her, it must have been the 3rd or 4th CMT meeting in. She stopped everyone and said, look, at the end of the day, we have got a mother who is on a train platform right now at Waterloo, not being able to use her car to pay for her ticket to go pick up her kids from school. How are we helping that woman on the ground? And I was like, and then that was then the catalyst of how, and you could see all the cogs whirring of how we were then operating with the banks and to help their contact centers reach their customers on the ground to say, I know you can't access money right now, but this is what we advise you do. And it was just the shift, that mindset was incredible. And that's the only other time I've seen somebody really take that lens, that human lens, and execute.
Thank you for sharing, that and the personal example as well. And I guess in closing, before we jump into a few questions, I would love each of you to just give me your 3 adjectives, words of what leading risk through uncertainty means and relate it to kind of the power of women, or what are 3 strong words that you see emerging now, or 3 words that describe this scene.
I'll jump in quickly, and I would say adaptive, decisive, and human-centered, given that that's our topic for today. There you go. I made that one easy, ladies.
Anyone else want to jump in with something?
I would say transparency, communication, and collaboration, because I feel like women are particularly adept at attention to detail and making sure that we are very mindful of what the workforce knows and what they need to know and how we can help them understand where we are and where we're going.
I would say flexibility, consistency, especially in behavior, and psychological safety again, building that. Emotional
Wonderful.
intelligence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
Good. You guys like chose all the best words, by the way. Like the only thing I could think of is adding in inclusivity into that. Like it has to be inclusive.
Mhm.
It has. I know, and I don't want to kind of go on and tick the D&I box here, but honestly, like this is the whole point of having a diverse team of people, because we all operate and think differently, and that needs to happen, especially being able to think outside the box for these kinds of solutions, right?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that it kind of concludes our session. We wanted to leave time for questions and answers. Ila, will you be taking those from the audience?
Yes, there is
Okay.
one in the chat box I can see already. It's
Okay.
directed to Farah. Farah, I can read it out for you. So it says, for a growing company building AI solutions, how do you recommend starting a simple risk framework that is strong enough for education industry clients, but still realistic for a startup? This is by Mani. She is from AI Empower, and she's building an agentic solutions and learning platform for colleges in Toronto.
So is this like a basic startup risk framework that you're looking for? I'm going to approach it from that because I think that's what you're asking. So I would say first, identify your own top risks. So what could actually hurt you as a business in the next 6 to 12 months? I think cash flow, that's a top any startup. Who are your key people? Think about your cyber, legal, reputation, operations. Yeah, I would say that's sort of your first in terms of identifying top risks. And then prioritize. Do not overcomplicate things, right? So score each risk. So what's the likelihood of it happening? And just keep it simple. Low, medium, high. What's the impact? Low, medium, high. And just focus on the few that are both high likelihood and high impact. And that's a good place to start and focus. And then decide, what are you going to do about it, right? So that's the most important thing. So for each key risk, think avoid, so stop doing it, or reduce and put your controls in place, or can you transfer it somewhere? So whether that's through insurance or contracts or whatever it may be. And are you willing to accept it as a risk? So if it's a low impact, assign an owner to everything. Every risk needs a name next to it. If everyone owns it, no one owns it, is my answer. So that becomes a really big problem. What else do we need to do? Simple controls. So you don't want theory, right? You need actual actions. So for example, what are your backups? How are contracts reviewed? Do you have 2 persons approvals in place? Do you have a clear comms plan? So all of those things, actionable, right? And then always review it regularly. Keep things moving as your business is growing. I run a small business. We're very agile. Things are constantly changing in terms of our business priorities. So yeah, just make sure that you are constantly looking at what your risks are and how they're changing. The other thing I will say, keep it to 1 page. If it doesn't fit on 1 page, it's not going to get used by yourself or by anyone else. So yeah, I think that's it. Practical, visible, hopefully actually used. I think that beats perfect every single time. Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Farah.
Thanks.
This was helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a whole framework in a one conversation. Thank you for that, Farah. That was quite comprehensive. Anyone else?
Considering I didn't even realize that was for me. I was like, oh, okay.
I think it just comes naturally, right? Any other question from any of the audience? We have the panel here still. Okay, so I can see one question. Human first insight for risk-ready leadership. As AI becomes more present in healthcare and education, how can leaders keep the human element strong while still benefiting from automation and intelligent agents? Anyone who would like to answer this?
I've got a view on this, and only because I'm working in smart city management at the moment, and all of the services are being designed and built with that citizen-centric view in mind and that human lens. It's around a topic called co-design. So it's been, every government's been greatly kind of encouraged that when they start looking at integrating their services against smart city strategies, they are not looking at the technology as the end goal, but to have the citizens and communities and people and the users and the stakeholders that will be experiencing said service or technology to be part of that co-design, right? So that's kind of what we need that to be led by. That's the view that we need to lead, and have the technology be the vehicle, right? To be the enabler to get to the end goal. Because the whole point is to make either lives easier or practitioners' lives and jobs easier, risk managers' lives and jobs easier. We need to start with that co-design workshop, or that group of stakeholders who are going to be directly impacted, be part of that design of that service or that thing or that product or that solution.
Thank you,
Can I
Sir.
jump in on that as well? Because tech,
Yes.
that conversation also is one that's a big one. You know, technology can process data, but only people can understand context, right? And intent and consequence being a key one there. And I think that risk leadership really fails when we start confusing efficiency with understanding. So keep judgment with people. That's what I really like to push and underline. Use AI as a tool. It's brilliant, but you can use it to inform your decision making, not make decisions, right? And there's a difference. Especially where your outcomes are affecting people's safety and livelihoods or trust. So yeah, that's just my quick jump into that one.
Yeah, agreed. You cannot take the human
I
side.
would also like to add something what
Sure.
Farah said. So the goal is, I mean, we are talking a lot about AI. How are we going to navigate AI? What are the challenges it's bringing for the workforce? From leadership perspective, the goal is not to build AI powered system. The goal is to use AI in a way, or a human centered systems which use AI efficiently. And I think as leader, we can agree that when efficiency replaces empathy or people systems, that's actually a failure. That's something we cannot work on. So the goal is just to strengthen our systems in a way that we can use AI efficiently, not AI replacing everything.
Absolutely. Totally agree. We've got one more question coming in. Can any of you share a specific high stakes example where you leveraged your emotional intelligence, EQ, to turn a chaotic situation into a resilient, organized outcome? This is from Shweta.
I can actually.
Sure, go ahead, Megha.
So for 4 years, I was working in an organization where we used to rescue the survivors of human trafficking. And as a result, we used to visit a lot of brothels, because there is a place where, they bring minor girls from different parts of the country, and they used to slave them. I mean, they used to traffic them, or sell them for sex to men. Okay. So, and you cannot do it. You need to have governance by your side. So you need to have support of the local police. You need to have support of all the NGOs. So I was part of one of the raids which happened. And though I'm part of HR, but I was very curious, like Save, I'm also a bit weirdo. And I thought, okay, I also want to be a part of the raid. I want to see how it happens. So we rescued 14 minor girls that day. And as a part of the process, they are, are required to, we need to bring them to police station. unfortunately, the situation is as such that, girls are also willing to make the trade in lieu of money because they need money. They are coming from, disadvantageous economic background. And so they were not willing to give that information to police, which would have resulted in, raid being successful and putting all the people behind the bars and, start the case on them. So I had to, we were thinking fast. It was 3 a.m. in the morning. It was the month of January. It gets very cold here in Delhi, India. So we started talking, and 1 hour we spoke to the girls. We created some safety net around it. We offered them food, drink, coffee, some warm beverage. We offered them stores so that they can cover themselves and feel protected. And from that we actually managed to get a statement out of them. So I think the idea is how fast you act and how you keep human element alive in such situation also.
Yes, amazing.
I can
Yes,
also add another quick example. So I work for NCIS, which supports the Navy and Marine Corps around the globe. And recently, just in having the base in Bahrain attacked, we had to set up a crisis action center off of our watch floor, which is part of my portfolio. And so we had to call in a lot of agents and analysts to come in and support the Navy and Marine Corps through that particular situation and the response after it was attacked. But we also had to be very mindful of the fact that a lot of people who were being called into the room had actually worked and lived in Bahrain. My husband and I did a tour for 1.5 years there. So just kind of taking people aside and saying, hey, like, I know you were stationed over there. I know you spent time there. I know that seeing a place that you lived can be very difficult, to see the photos and to hear the stories coming out of the country. And just kind of taking that minute and giving people a second to catch their breath and kind of take a beat before jumping back into the work. I think that, ultimately just gave them a moment, to kind of appreciate, their experience and to also really, understand or try to understand what those working for us in the country are actually going through at the particular time, which then drove a lot of our decisions as far as the things we needed to consider on the human side, as far as how we supported our personnel in country and their families.
Yeah, if we have time, Ila, I just had one question for the group, this extraordinary panel of women, that are truly empowered and in positions of risk, in crisis, security. I share, I started my career with Kroll, and then some of you have worked at Control Risk, so it was nice. It's nice to see those alumni, but I've seen quite a shift since the 25 years ago that I started, where it was almost all men in both the risk management side, the consulting side, and for sure the corporate security. And like some of you mentioned here, the whole position of a corporate security has shifted to more strategic. But my question for all of you is, are you seeing a shift in diversity? Are there more women in your, in the interactions you have with your clients getting into these key roles? And, or do you think we still have a long way to go?
So I think it can also be quite region specific. Like I'm based in Saudi, so I am seeing a lot. Again, it's very male dominated. I've now joined a new company, and I'm actually reporting to a woman who is the kind of the partner and risk leader for all types of risk and resilience practices, which is a breath of fresh air for me. This is the first time I've had to report to a woman, so I'm actually very, very excited. But what I'm seeing on the government side here in Saudi Arabia is there's a lot of women in leadership roles and positions in government entities, which I'm very, very excited to see, because I feel like, I guess reputationally, the Middle East is not seen for being as evolved in that level of equality. And what I see on the ground is that it is. It's just kind of misrepresented, obviously, media and news and things like that. So I think in corporate environments, I've worked for nothing but men, being only female in teams. I'm now in an organization that is a lot of women leadership in place, and I'm seeing a lot of government clients have a lot of women in those kind of key roles as well. So it's it's making its way, it's moving, but maybe other regions that you guys are in are a lot different, or the balance may be a lot different. I don't know.
Yeah, I would say the UK is relatively progressive, and I do see a lot of women in this space, but I'm also very conscious that I actively seek them out. So it may partly be that I've built a network where they're more visible to me. But I think here where the gap really exists on the security side in frontline roles, you know, we're seeing more women in the leadership conversations and strategy and specialist areas, but not as many coming through in the operational pipeline as much, and certainly not in the same numbers. And that does matter, right? Because leadership is not something that exists in its isolation. You know, if we're not building that pipeline at the frontline level, then we're limiting who's going to progress into these more senior roles later on. I think it's moving in the right direction, but a bit unevenly. There is progress at the top and in visibility and in more diversity, but actually we need to be doing more to be bringing women into the full spectrum of roles across the industry. I would also say, like, I do a lot of work in international environments and in Africa, and in those cases, many of the environments I'm in, I'm still the only woman on a project. So, you know, it's a very different environment. So yeah, I think there is progress happening, but it's very uneven. And as everyone said, you know, it's very much dependent on region.
Yeah, it depends on region, the role, and the level of the leadership, and the kind of function that you're into. So intelligence, you see more of females compared to security. HR, there are plentiful, you know, people. So I think it's a whole. And then if you move towards the leadership side, so junior and mid-level, there are quite a few, but leadership, there are very few, I would say. And it's across regions. It's nothing to do with just one region. I've seen that trends across the regions, but that's exactly the reason why we are having this conversation today in the first place, I would say. Right. Any other questions? I think there's one more question we are seeing from Tarun. With the world currently witnessing a combination of circumstances that have never been seen before, like COVID, in which direction do you think, do you speculate the global economic safety and security will head into? And as individuals, how should we work on getting a head start into perspective shift internally to leverage being more aligned to the new world order?
I'll jump in. I had to say, I was trying to think about that a moment in reading it.
Yes.
I think what we're actually seeing isn't like a single new world order, but what we are seeing is more of a period of sustained instability becoming the norm. So I'd say across economics, safety, security, we've got a few very clear directions emerging. So on the economic side, we're moving more towards fragmentation rather than this full globalization that we were heading in. We've got supply chains being far more regionalized now. Resilience is being prioritized over efficiency. Geopolitical tensions are shaping our trade and investment decisions more. The IMF has consistently highlighted that growth is under pressure from trade tensions, policy shifts, uncertainty. But then from a security perspective, we've got risks becoming more interconnected, right? So cyber, misinformation, geopolitical conflict, societal tensions, all of it. None of these things are separate issues anymore. You know, they're all overlapping and they're amplifying each other far more than before. And that goes back to kind of all the things I was saying about online as well. I know there was some reports about, you know, things like disinformation as well. It was the World Economic Forum I was reading recently, talking about disinformation, cyber insecurity, and geopolitical competition, basically saying that those are some of the most immediate risks that we are facing right now. So we're looking at complexity, right? It's less predictability, more overlap, and very fast escalation at the moment, which means the question isn't how do we predict the future, it's how do we become better at operating in uncertainty, right? And I think for individuals, which is your question, that internal shift is really important, and just as important as the external bigger ones. So first of all, move away from certainty and become adaptable, because that is what's going to get you through this world right now, right? There is no stable path or a fixed playbook at the moment. Throw it all out the window. You need to be able to reassess really quickly and pivot without losing your direction and your core. Equally, like, develop your own sound judgment, right? And not just knowledge. Knowledge is great, but judgment, because critical thinking in today's world is, again, rarity, and that's becoming an issue. Information is everywhere. We talked about AI. It can give you answers, but actually knowing what is important and what matters and what is credible and what action that you need to take is where real value sits, right? And the last one, I would say, emotional resilience. Work on that, because we're all going to be needing it. Sav made some great points earlier about mothers. I'm not a mother, but I see it, I respect it. But we are operating in a far more volatile information environment now, and constant news and conflicting narratives and high pressure situations. So being able to stay calm and think clearly and not get pulled into reactionary decision making, that's a massive differentiator that we're seeing in good leadership right now as well, right? And pulling it back into the conversation we just had, stay human, please. Systems, technology, all of this stuff is there. All of our relationships and our trust and our communication, these are the things that become more important in times like this. So yeah, that's the personal that I would say.
Thank you so much. I think no more questions we can take, actually, because Dr. Mary has been waiting for a very long time for Fireside Chat. So thank you, Cynthia, and each of the panelists. I think it was quite an insightful discussion indeed. What really stands out to me is clearly that the leadership is being redefined in real time. I sincerely have key takeaways from each of you. So Save talked about strategic thinking, which is no longer a top management thing. Leadership is, it needs to be across the layers and levels. Farah talking about importance of communication and human-centric approach. Megha talking about the early signs of, risk identification and how they show up in the pattern and often overlooked. Megan talking about the importance of relationships outside of crisis to ensure that the support is available in time, and also each unique role the organization, the stakeholders, the customers have within the intelligence-based decision making. So thank you everyone for your wonderful insights. I'm sure the audience have a number of great takeaways. So let's move on now to our next segment, which is the Fireside Chat with Dr. Mary. And let us welcome her, with a brief introduction. She's our special guest today. And I personally cherish this moment of having her here with us today, sincerely. Just for introduction, Dr. Mary Grogan is an educator, author, speaker, and leadership coach focused on social justice and humanitarian leadership. She holds a PhD in educational leadership and has served as a teacher, counselor, principal across diverse communities, including immigrants and refugees. She is the author of The 7 C's of Global Leadership. I highly recommend everyone should read it. A reflective framework it is for building inclusive, impactful leadership. She has taught and presented internationally. She's a professor at George Brown College, Toronto. Her work integrates therapeutic and reflective practices to help individuals unlock leadership potential and drive meaningful action. Mary, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I could sit and listen to the group of women here all morning, because leadership is really in a female perspective. We really have all of the qualities to help make shift to deal with risk. Thank you for the introduction. If it kept up, we'd be here a little while. It tells you that I'm a seasoned leader, and it tells you that continuous learning is all part of who I am, and my curiosity is wanting me to connect more with you as women and commend you on the kind of high level conversation that's happened today. So grateful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Even hearing from this morning, from the women and people who are really working at that level of risk. Okay, I certainly don't have a background in helping corporate, but I have worked in school systems in crisis and crisis teams, and even living in an environment in the Caribbean where the risk of hurricane was required planning, and no matter how much we planned, we weren't ready. Doesn't matter. We can talk all we want. And I used to sit there thinking, there's something missing here. Everybody's having their ideas about what it would look like, but people are preparing the mindset to deal with what happens. And so at that point is quite late in my career, I made the discovery that reflection, the capacity to reflect and to critically think about our own experiences and how to recognize patterns that would help us as a foundation to grow, to expand, to connect, to gain clarity. And so it was then I began a PhD when I was 57 and finished at 62. So I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm really interested in people's stories, because out of the stories is incredible strength. And every woman here that talked about their perspective, their experience is so rich that we could solve the global political questions and the issues, the security issues, financial, population, trafficking, just by having this kind of conversation. So for me, the question is not about risk as much as about who are the leaders and how are the leaders being formed to deal with what we're dealing with in terms of instability, in terms of resilience. Our language has to change. Our paradigm has to change. We usually are thinking about companies and silos, even in education. Education's over here, research over here, business over here. I think the time now is to say leaders must shift from trying to control risk to developing an awareness, moving from control to awareness, to being conscious. And risk is not always a threat, but an invitation. I think we need to change the perspective and say, this is a signal to our head, our body. Our body tells us. Our neurochemistry is signaled from our body, reactive mode. And so reflective leaders learn to ask, what's the moment revealing for me? And what assumptions am I holding on to? Because we all come from culture, history, we've learned experience from our education institutions, which we know are very culturally contextual, and formed from an industrial society base. There's a lot of assumptions that risk, because our natural reaction is to react and feel safe, get our body safe, that we're failing to take advantage of the moment, to pause. And I think that's the magic, that's the secret. And for me, in my doctoral work, in my lived experience working with leaders, a couple things happen. One, people think if they're not in the position of authority, they have nothing to contribute. They're not the leader. And I can tell you that as an itinerant counselor with a school board for 18 years, many times when they asked me to move into leadership, to run a school, run a district, I had children and I said, I'm not willing. There were no systems in place to allow flexibility so that women with children could actually move into positions that kept them away from home all the time. It's a bit better now with Zoom. But at the same time, the whole notion of childcare, the whole notion of is a woman's responsibility, the emotional labor that goes into having a partner and being a caretaker of children and senior ailing parents. The whole social, emotional obligations of women have really kept women at many times held back in their own mind. I've been there, I know. I've had to work it through, and often in isolation. And the power that helped me to be resilient and to grow was my capacity, my discipline, not just something I do it every day. I step back, pause, and stop the noise around me to get clarity. What's my experience teaching me? What do I need to learn for my own awareness, my own leadership of self in a world dominated by a lot of values that I don't agree with. So I'm excited to hear people talk about how do we create humanized environments. And when you think of it in a visual sense, the kind of global leadership I talk about is founded on the principle of Ubuntu, which comes from an African principle that we belong to each other. We're seeing that globally right now. It's hurting us. I don't live in the Middle East. I have friends there. I've taught international students. I've worked with refugees. So I can't imagine. Those are my family. That being in education, being in business, being a facilitator, being a counselor, we know we're in tremendous power positions with empathy, insight, capacity to connect. And I think that's what makes women leadership. I talk about it differently with women. We have it already. We know that the king is the most important person. Piece on the chessboard, but it's the queen that rules the board. And I talked about this yesterday in a presentation. We forget that we're queens. We have within us incredible capacity. The question is not so much how do we take care of everybody else, which is part of your job, to strategically plan to make sure things are safe and to deal with crisis for sure. But it's how do I manage to be self-aware and critical about my own place in this? Because leaders who react, which we see all the time, it's been a very male model. They don't need to worry about internal because a lot of the emotional labor is dealt with by other people, either being silent or withdrawing, right? Or moving. They don't stay. And we're looking at young people going into companies where the culture of leadership is still at the top. And we need to say, if we hire you, you are a leader. Every time you walk into a space, every time you have a thought, every time you have an idea or a task, we expect you to use the lens of leadership, which requires a practice of reflection, pausing, reflecting on your experience. And that has to be taught. In all my doctoral work, it is the single most effective tool for development, professional development, that is never taught in schools. If you think of how we measure schools and success, it's capacity exam. What's the number? Where do you rank? How do you get in? How do you get out? It's quantitative.
Yeah.
And we talk like that, and we talk like that about consumer and profit. And we need to step back and say, if we're going to humanize, if we're going to lead different cultures, we have to first look at ourselves and use the moments of difficulty, the risk, to sit with the uncomfortableness, to be honest, to sit with it, grab it, hold on to it, own it, celebrate it, and say, I'm quite capable. I'm going to befriend you, and you're going to teach me what to do next. And I think that kind of power women have. They already have it. They do it all the time. It's a matter of working out how do we work in systems that really don't have that kind of competency. Because I know what I like to do. I like to challenge. I like to deal with, I'm not afraid of conflict. I don't like it. But I've learned in my old age that if I'm going to deal with a system that is not willing to listen, and I'm not going to spend all my energy trying to convince somebody. So I will invite, and I've learned that leadership requires that kind of pause. I have to see, is this about my ego, or is this about the people I'm serving? Is this an empowering stance, or is it confrontational? What's speaking here? What assumptions am I making? I can only work through that. I can only do that with self-compassion. I can only do that in a space that blocks out the noise. And then I can examine my assumptions, what I've learned, even from success. And how do I rethink those? How do I take out what's true and discard what's no longer working? Those are some thoughts.
Amazing. Yeah.
It's how we
No.
build kids.
Amazing. I think it's all, in our minds as well. I had read one book on leadership, I remember, and it just said that each one of us can be a leader. It's all about how we feel about our work and how we conduct our work. whether we do it to the utmost, truthfulness, honesty, and integrity, and we become a leader in doing so. I think that's the mindset we all need to carry to be leaders. We don't have to be, really be a leader in the role for that matter. So, your work really emphasizes on self-reflection as the foundation of leadership. Why do you think looking inward is so critical especially in today's complex, fast-moving world?
The minute you can step back and be with yourself, you're going to have the most important relationship that you will ever have in how you manage others. How can I empower somebody like Cynthia or Megha if I'm not empowered myself? If I'm lacking self-awareness and I'm lacking what's getting in my way? How can I connect with compassion if I think I'm right, if everything I know is true, without having that curiosity and courage to look at myself and reframe, rethink, look at some of my experiences and realize my experiences aren't necessarily what other people have experienced. So why is it I would assume that they're in the same place or what burdens they're carrying? Women are quite different than they were in my generation. We put the children first and the home first. A husband that was the mark of success. Well, that's no longer the key now. Maybe a partner, but it doesn't have to be a man. Maybe the partner doesn't even live with you. Maybe the children are shared. Maybe there's a lot of family issues that are evolving. So if I don't have that awareness myself of the patterns I'm holding, how can I empower my team to build trust in themselves and each other? How can we have a safe space when I'm not safe, when I'm not willing to do the work with my own self? And how can I expect Megha or Cynthia or you to grow if I don't model it? And it's the thing that we haven't taught people. We really, if you look at parenting from the West, it's a lot about making our children happy. Well, that's a false, making them safe. Well, that's no longer a reality in the world. I have friends who at this age are saying to their grandchildren, I don't want them watching the news. I don't want them being uncomfortable. I hope they get a reward at the end of the year. And I say, you know what? We live in a global world. The business you're doing in your country is impacting a company in China. Their environmental problem or their flood in their company will impact the price of a Christmas toy in America. What's happening in your own building is an effect. So as a human being, we need to be able to look at our own values, culture, religion, what shaped us. Because if we want diverse voices, we have to be comfortable within ourselves to look at where and how we can shape. Because people from different cultures, different life experience, different age, different people who've come through as refugees, for example, or people with a disability, maybe a hearing impairment or a neurodivergent, they're entering the workplace with their own gifts. And we have not been taught how to shift the paradigm of how do we engage and use their gifts and help them develop themselves. Because that's our biggest strength as our team.
I think that's a very underrated conversation of our times, I would say. I've not seen, for whatever, in my 2 decades of career, people handling diversity with the kind of mindfulness that is required to handle. And diversity has so many different paradigms. It doesn't come in just one, form and manner. I think the view you've given about diversity is amazing. And I'm sure a lot of people here will go back with a new outlook towards that completely. Mary, we often, talk about creating opportunities within risk, and you just spoke about it as well. So how should, leaders rethink risk today? Not just something to mitigate, but as something to understand, anticipate, and actively lead through?
I think that's a great question. I think as many of you have talked about, first your mindset. And risk or challenge in the Japanese symbol, the whole symbol is risk, the fear of it, but also the opportunity.
Yes.
And when we're looking at what's going on in the world, I don't know about you, but my first reaction is to be afraid. So I'm paying attention to my body. And as the leader, whether it's a school I'm operating, a team I'm operating corporately, somebody that I'm coaching, I have to be careful that my own reactions not clouding the lens of my language. So I have to review my language. Do I really believe that? Most of us neurologically are wired to be comfortable. We're wired for sameness. It's not great to have the speed and the complexity throwing it at us. The only way we can even sort that out like a pile of wool that's all tangled is to develop a pause and to role model it, to expect my people on the team to do the same. So it used to be when I dealt with conflict on my team, I'd bring 2 people in and we'd work through a conflict model, okay? But now I would say, I'd like you to reflect. I'm giving you 10 or 50. Reflect on how you feel, how you think, and what you need. So start with the head or start with the heart, but go back and forth and down to what you need. Then enter the conversation. I would have that reflection prior to coming in so that the language of blame and shame is not allowed. It's stopped. Because that's how we were raised. We were raised as human beings to make sure that we protect our ego. And we're dealing with a lot of people who are not as well developed. That, I think, is the biggest challenge. So if I had a team now, I would be careful of my language. I would ask them about their mindset and ask them to explain how they feel. So when we're talking about humanizing environments, we can think, okay, I've hired 5 different people, different countries, different background. I've been such a great leader. But if I don't engage them and get them to tell me what's missing or what they need to grow, I'm not including. So I'm bringing 5 or 6 people around the table, but I'm not really inviting voices. Sometimes we pay attention to the noise, but we don't pay attention to the silence. So if I went back and reviewed a day like that, who spoke, who didn't, who sat with who rolled their eyes, how was I feeling about that? Who did I shut out? Not consciously, but then go back and check with my people. That's something they don't teach you. That's something you don't learn in leadership courses. That's something I never learned for sure. I grew up in a very hierarchical model, Catholic schools. Wonderful. I'm not saying anything negative, but it was a very male, hierarchical, rigid. I'm right, you're wrong. This is right, this is wrong. This is the right way, this is the wrong. Very clear, but we know life isn't like that. And the leaders today are being asked to lead without sufficient support in companies, without coaching.
Yeah.
So we put you in a position. This is a lot of the work I do is people are in get a position, but then they don't have anybody to talk with about this is how I'm feeling. This is me. It's like crazy making. And so first what I get them to do is to reflect on the experience, say, what's informing you? Is it your head, your body? Maybe that's what we need to do is get calm so that we can strategically plan moving forward, so that we can strategically decide who we're going to invite to the collaborative solution. You're not alone. And that's the change of leadership. We talk about being decisive, but we cannot be decisive if we're not aware of the values that are grounding our decision. And reaction is usually an ego-centered, protective way of responding. It's like the old reactive discipline. That's what we used for children. It kept them quiet and in line. But it's not bringing growth. It doesn't really develop the people. And leaders now cannot do it alone.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very lonely space sometimes at the top, like you said, and they are in the role, but you have nobody to talk to. There's definitely a void, and I think that's a very good approach you have spoken about. Now, you've spoken about this conscious leadership, Mary, and as a one-time activity, I'm sure people would do it. But how can leaders sustain it amid constant pressure and change, which is evolving all the time around them?
Without being political, I remember hearing Obama say the reason that he can stay grounded is that he closes his door for 10 or 15 minutes a day and didn't let anybody in. He put a sign, "Do not disturb," as if he was on the phone, but he wasn't. He said, "And I'm thinking." And I guarantee if you look at your agenda, you don't have reflective time. It's usually rush, juggle, right? Run faster, do more, and then all of that other kind of doubt that creeps in because things are moving so fast. You haven't had a chance to get the feedback. Things happen quickly. So even in disaster, sometimes what I used to do is just go into a room, close the door, and people couldn't find me for 10 minutes because I was aware that I was reacting. So once you schedule it in, I schedule it in at the end of the day. And if things are really crazy, everybody goes to the bathroom, everybody gets a drink of water, use that time to find a space. I think your job as the leader is to make space for yourself. 10 or 15 minutes a day isn't a bad thing. And at the end of that reflection, you may shift how you strategize. You know what? I'm not sure. I think I'm going to call Cynthia. I'm not sure. I'm going to text Megan. I bet she's handled this better than I don't know. Here's what I'm doing. I need to run it by somebody I trust.
Yeah.
Right? If you've got everybody in the room, your consultants, your leadership, and everybody thinks the same, then nobody's thinking. And I think what you're talking about is we need to be resilient. We need to build trust, but it begins with yourself.
Absolutely.
We're so afraid. I think there's a lot of fear of all sorts of things, right? You can't have multiple wars and not be afraid right now. You can't. Whether you're running a business in Saudi Arabia or in America or Canada, we're all feeling it for different reasons. And it's very hard to think when you're afraid. The part of the brain that plans and forms thinking critical is not possible when it's overcome with fear and anxiety. The only way to calm that and get clarity is to schedule that pause time. Even if you sit with yourself, the body calms, the head works. We can't listen when the body's not calm. So there's a
Amazing.
difference after 10 minutes of saying, you know what, I think right now I'm operating out of fear, or maybe I need to get everybody safe with one command, and then I need to do this differently, or I need to consult, or I need to then take another 10 minutes. I can only manage this part. This is the priority. Because we're human. So we talk about humanizing space, but then the leaders don't recognize the humanity and the beauty and the power and the sacredness that they have in their own experience.
So true. Amazing. I think those are some of the very key takeaways that many of the participants are already taking. I'm getting comments also from everyone. I know, a decade is a long time to anticipate in a fast-moving world, but if you had to redefine leadership for the next 10 years in one sentence, what would it be?
I think it has to be self-awareness that only comes with I call it reflective, inclusive leadership. Without reflection, we go blindly on our way, creating the same unintended consequences. This is a time of severe disruption on every institution, every way that we see things, whether it's religion, education, corporate, geopolitical, leadership paradigms, whatever's going on. Without reflection, we go blindly on our way. We will continue to resist and move forward. And people who are in companies who are trying to make that shift are going to be further and further silenced because right now we're in a very reactive leadership role. That's what's got success to this point. Very clear, rigid model. So I'm sure all of the women here in this group, as they have reflected and tried to have difficult conversations, prepare for difficult, have felt such extreme resistance. It's not over, but it's there. Some of it is gender-based, but some of it is paradigms. You're asking people to feel something. We're so afraid. I think there's a lot of fear of all sorts of things, right? You can't have multiple wars and not be afraid right now. You can't. Whether you're running a business in Saudi Arabia or in America or Canada, we're all feeling it for different reasons. And it's very hard to think when you're afraid. The part of the brain that plans and forms thinking critical is not possible when it's overcome with fear and anxiety. The only way to calm that and get clarity is to schedule that pause time. Even if you sit with yourself, the body calms, the head works. We can't listen when the body's not calm. So that's after 10 minutes of saying, you know what, I think right now I'm operating out of fear, or maybe I need to get everybody safe with one command, and then I need to do this differently, or I need to consult, or I need to then take another 10 minutes. I can only manage this part. This is the priority. Because we're human. So we talk about humanizing space, but then the leaders don't recognize the humanity and the beauty and the power and the sacredness that they have in their own experience.
So true. Amazing. That I think those are some of the very key takeaways that many of the participants are already taking. I'm getting comments also from everyone. I know, a decade is a long time to anticipate in a fast-moving world, but if you had to redefine leadership for the next 10 years in one sentence, what would it be?
I think it has to be self-awareness that only comes with I call it reflective, inclusive leadership. Without reflection, we go blindly on our way, creating this. I think it has to be self-awareness that only comes with I call it reflective, inclusive leadership. Without reflection, we go blindly on our way, creating the same unintended consequences. This is a time of severe disruption on every institution, every way that we see things, whether it's religion, education, corporate, geopolitical, leadership paradigms, whatever's going on. Without reflection, we go blindly on our way. We will continue to resist and move forward. And people who are in companies who are trying to make that shift are going to be further and further silenced, because right now we're in a very reactive leadership role. That's what's got success to this point. Very clear, rigid model. So I'm sure all of the women here in this group, as they have reflected and tried to have difficult conversations, prepare for difficult, have felt such extreme resistance. It's not overt, but it's there. Some of it is gender-based, but some of it is paradigm. You're asking people to feel something. And the only way that we could have a war is if we didn't feel. And if we really believe power works. It has a lot of good secondary gains economically, but it's not going to help us move forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
If you think of agriculture and food, we have to rethink how we start managing food. In a country like Canada, for example, they're exploring all different ways to grow over the winter, not just with a greenhouse, but some vertical and hydroponics. Not that I know what that is, but I've been reading how people are trying to move things forward, and they're getting a lot of resistance because it does take a stepping back. It does take a different kind of scheme. It does take incorporating knowledge from research that we're not used to doing. We usually see academic and research as separate, and we need to integrate it. The only way we can do that is to reflect on our experience. Take that pause. Where's the gap? What are the assumptions I'm making? What am I missing? Where can I go from here? What's the action that will shift that?
Yeah, I think it's a very simple process, and it's going to be very effective if we tend to imbibe it the way it is designed. Thank you, Dr. Mary, for those wonderful insights. If there are any questions for Dr. Mary, I would like to invite those as well from the audience. Or the panelists.
To be with people who are doing the work. It's just incredible. It's an incredible experience. And I will leave reflecting on what I didn't know and what assumptions I had around risk and how narrow I know what it is, because that's all I know. And so these kind of forums are really one of the ways that we build a more reflective leader. A reflective leader will be more inclusive because they'll realize what they don't have, right? What they need.
Yeah, I think Farah has a question here. How have you navigated moments of imposter syndrome in your own leadership journey, and what practical advice would you give to others stepping into the high stakes roles who may feel the same? I feel like this is something experienced by women disproportionately.
I think that's an excellent question. I don't think you could live, if you're a self-aware person, without moments of self-doubt. And I hate the word imposter because I think it's human. I think it's probably one of the things that women have as a gift, to be able to say, what is it? why am I feeling the burden? I didn't create this problem. Why am I feeling like I'm not capable? Where's that message coming from? So I've had many moments of self-doubt. When I first became a principal, and I started to initiate a new literacy program that my research would look like, I had much feedback from people who were real specialists in experience. And they would sneak and do things against what I was asking. So I would pop in and visit, and I could feel myself